kept us suppressed. Now, even though Uncle Bub was a very old man, his mind was very sharp, and he was very lucid, and he would tell him all of these stories. And one story in particular kind of stuck with my husband. He said, "Massa took me off to the war and made me a soldier when I was just a boy." Now, because that was one of the many stories that his Uncle Bub told him over time, he kind of chucked it in the back of his head, but it would have great relevance later on. Uncle Bub also had a trunk that he kept in the rear room of his house, but every time my husband would go near it, he would chase him away, which made him even more curious. He said sometimes when his Uncle Bub wasn't watching, he would hit the lock, hoping maybe the top would fly open, but of course it never did. Now, Uncle Bub lived to be 109 years old, which I know is quite remarkable, but not that unusual. As a matter of fact, I tell many of my viewers, when you have an opportunity to go on the internet and type in slave narratives, not only will you be able to see the images of the formerly enslaved, but you'll also be able to see their ages. Many of them lived in their 80s, 90s, and 100s, which speaks to the longevity of the African American, but it also speaks to their strength. Now, when my husband was in his early 20s, he decided to go back to Rock Hill to see if he could find the house that he had spent so many fond memories with his Uncle Bub. Now, we had a hard time finding the house at first because a tree had actually fallen over on it, and tree branches and everything were growing out of the windows. But because he was familiar with the area, he kept on searching, and he found the house. Now, you can imagine the first thing he looked for. You're right, the trunk. And here's the trunk. This is the trunk that my husband was so fascinated by. And this is Uncle Bub. We're not sure how old Uncle Bub was, but we suspect that he may have been in his 90s at least, because he was always, like I said, very sharp and very lucid. Now, my husband pulls out this trunk, which wasn't very difficult to do because the weather had gotten to it. And as he looked in the trunk, there were a bunch of old raggedy clothes and a small plow. I asked my husband, "Why would your uncle have a small plow in his trunk?" He says he remembers Uncle Bub telling him that when he was a young man, he used to lease him out to the white farmers in the area to plow small portions of their property. And he had an old mule for a long time. But he said when that old mule died, Uncle Bub said he would put that harness on his back and literally plow that land with the strength of his own body. Now that not only speaks to the fact that Uncle Bub was strong, but it also speaks to the fact that Uncle Bub was an entrepreneur. He made a way out of no way. And quite frankly, entrepreneurship runs very deep in the Ragsdale clan, which I'll tell you about later on. So as he's rummaging through this trunk, he hits a chain. And this chain is attached to this shackle. Now, this is a very rare shackle. First of all, I want you to notice, it has a leather piece inside of this. This would go around the neck of an enslaved male, go around his neck. And this leather piece was not to give him comfort, but to keep him from getting all marked up, because he would lose value if he was all scarred up. Remember, we were property, all right? Now I'm gonna hold this shackle up. It's very heavy. This part alone is about 12 pounds. But this, which I'm gonna ask my cameraman to zoom down to, pan down to, is 40 pounds of pure iron. Now, again, this would go around a male slave's neck. And of course he wouldn't be holding it because his arms would be shackled behind his back. But when I drop this ball, notice where this would hit the slave if he tried to run away. He wouldn't get very far, would he, with something like this banging up against him. The master called this an iron ball shackle. And he would say if the nigger could survive this, he must have iron balls. That's where the term iron balls came from. It was this shackle that inspired my husband to want to collect all these other shackles and other forms of ironware that you see here today. Here's a shackle that was made in Europe. They were striking iron in the 1800s in Europe. They weren't striking iron in Africa at that time. But my husband found these in America. which stands to reason that they probably came over on a boat on an enslaved African. This is called a coffle, C-O-F-F-L-E. It's a long chain that will allow them to maybe put 5 or 6 shackles on this chain to be able to transport numerous slaves all at one time. Either end of this shackle would go around somebody's neck, and they were transporting these people at a fast pace. If someone fell, they could possibly lose their head. Again, they had more Africans that they could replace you with. Here's another form of coffle. This would go around the wrist, and they'd be able to transport at least 4 slaves. Now, here's a shackle. It has a ring on it. Shackles that have rings on it like this would be used to hook to the back of a horse or the back of a wagon to transport that enslaved person. I'm going to share some more of our shackles with you, but before I do that, I want to bring your attention to this map. This is a very rare map. This map was created in 1729 by a European geographer by the last name of Mole. This is just the tip of West Africa, just the tip. Now, even though it shows you the tip of West Africa, he didn't even bother to call it Africa. Look what he called it, Negro land, where you go to get Negroes. Now, this European created this map so that the colonizers in North America could determine where they wanted to get their Negroes from. And they spent quite a bit of time studying this map because enslaved Africans were chosen for their natural abilities and talents. In other words, they wanted you to hit the ground running. They want you to come already experienced. So for instance, a plantation owner in South Carolina, he was specifically interested in this map, which is the tip of West Africa. So a European or a colonizer in South Carolina, as I said, was particularly interested in enslaved Africans who knew how to grow grain because they had a lot of rice plantations in South Carolina. So as he studied this map, he would say, bring me enslaved Africans from Sierra Leone. There in Sierra Leone, those Africans had been growing grain for hundreds of years, for decades. So much so that they became so specialized in it that they built dikes that would allow the water to come up, to go in, and dikes that would lower to let the water out. Interestingly enough, those Africans who were taken from Sierra Leone into South Carolina, many of those Africans who live in that part of South Carolina today can trace their roots all the way back to Sierra Leone. They're called the Gullah Geechee people. You may have heard of them. They have their own culture and their own language. Now, if they wanted big, strong males to use as laborers, because laborers were highly sought after at that time, they were building a nation that they had stolen from the indigenous people. He would say, bring me enslaved African males from Mandinga or Mandinga. And by the way, again, this map was created in 1729. So many of these countries are spelled differently than when we spell them now. That's actually Mali. Mali, of course, is spelled M-A-L-I today. And this is Benin with an extra N. Now, in Mandinga, the African males grew over 7 feet tall, 250 pounds or more. I can't help it, but every time I look at Shaquille O'Neal, I often wonder if he ever did his ancestry, probably found out that he has some Mandinga in him. Now, interestingly enough, when the Europeans first arrived in Africa, they didn't first arrive in West Africa. They first arrived up here in North Africa, where you have Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Sudan. Now, I hope most of you understand and know that Egypt is a part of Africa, because I sometimes get people who question that. Yes, Egypt is a part of Africa. And the reason why some people are so confused is because even when they talk about Egypt on the television, they never say Africa. They usually say the Middle East. There's no such thing as the Middle East. It's either Africa or it's not. Now, living up here in this part of Africa, were the North African Arabs. Now, they're described in the slave manifest as the fair-skinned, curly-haired Africans, but they're Africans nonetheless. Now, the Europeans started trading with these North African Arabs. They started trading things like this. These are called agates. Some people think they're ivory, but they're not. And when they're polished, they get this high gloss on them. They also have holes on either end, which stands to reason that they may have been strung together at some point and used as jewelry. They also traded in decorative glass stones. Nothing particularly exciting about them other than the fact that Africans found them exciting. They also traded in this. This is a horseshoe-shaped piece of iron called a manila. Now, interestingly enough, as I mentioned, they did not have iron objects in Africa, which made that much more valuable for these Africans. As a matter of fact, as they traded for these things, this manila, they started using it as currency amongst themselves. Even though I can't imagine carrying a bunch of these around in my wallet today, or my purse today. And these things, which you probably recognize, are called cowrie shells. They said a handful of cowrie shells could purchase an entire tribe of Africans. Imagine that. Now, in turn, the Africans started trading them skins, animal skins, feathers, spices, seeds. I bet you didn't know this, but many of the seeds that they traded with these Europeans traded for, or with these Africans traded for, are still in our diets today. Black-eyed peas, watermelon seeds, and okra seeds all originated in Africa. They came over on the boat with enslaved Africans. Isn't that interesting? Now, it wasn't long before these Europeans realized that there was a form of slavery going on even before they came. Now, European slave trade ran from 1500 to 1870. Now, there was slavery going on all over the world at that time. They were enslaving each other in Ireland, enslaving each other in Italy, in China. It was just a custom at the time. However, in Africa, if you were captured by another African, you were considered a captive of war, and they would simply take you to another part of Africa. You never left the continent. But Europeans changed all that because they realized that these North African Arabs were willing to sell their captives of war. And they did something that would change slavery in Africa forever. They gave them guns. Guns did not exist in the African culture before the Europeans gave it to them. Once they did that, slavery went from a trickle to a flood. They would send these Arabs into the villages 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and they would shoot off their guns. It's the first time Africans had ever heard gunfire, and they would immediately gather them up and start marching them towards the coastline. At the time, Africans were only fighting with spears and bows and arrows. They didn't have guns, all right? Imagine, you can't even imagine trying to take a spear and a bow and arrow to a gunfight. Guess what happened then? Other slavers or kings, and like the Arabs, Moors, and other African leaders, they started trading their Africans away to the Englishmen as well. It became terribly chaotic, and it was all based on a lie. They thought that they were taking their people to another part of the continent. Now, they didn't always have heavy iron shackles. Sometimes they would use tree limbs tied together with heavy vines. The idea was to get you down to the coastline and put you in what is called slave castles, which are actually forts. Every European country had their own fort. This is the one in Ghana, and this is the one in Senegal.
All of them, they left and they all took something.
This is
When
my
I
husband.
question about it, that's when
Somebody needs to mute. This is my husband standing off the coastline in the one in Ghana. And if you notice, they had cannonballs and cannons because the Europeans were fighting each other, overturning each other's forts to steal the Africans that the other Europeans were stealing out of there, as well as the items that they were pillaging out of Africa. As I said, it became terribly chaotic. Now, it's not like these Africans didn't fight back. They tried desperately because they saw the ships coming. They saw them loading their people onto the slave ships. But by the time they realized what was going on, it was too late. African warriors fiercely fought back, but they were no competition for the Europeans with guns and complicit Africans. Now, they were taking you through the bush as quickly as possible. Groups of slavers would take Africans through the bushland. Now, they wanted to travel at a fast pace because they were afraid another group of slavers would be able to come along and overtake them and steal their Africans. Again, it was just constant pandemonium. Slaves who couldn't keep up or fell ill, they wouldn't leave you there. They would put your head in a vise and smash you in your head, or tie you to a tree, open your stomach, and leave you for the hyenas to eat you. Again, slavery was horrendous, absolutely horrendous. Young African males, young boys, were highly sought after by European slavers. The reason young males were so highly sought after is because they were young. And because they were young, Europeans realized that they could brainwash them. They could mold their minds to become dutiful slaves for the rest of their lives. Somebody older would have to be beaten into submission, not that they would mind. Many of the Africans who were captured had different facial markings, which indicated what tribe they belonged to. They also spoke different dialects, which made it difficult for them to communicate with each other initially. They also wore different hairstyles, which I find interesting today, because in our community, we all wear different hairstyles. But the Europeans, you know what they would do? They shaved their heads, automatically eradicating their sense of culture and identity. And remember, we still haven't left the continent yet. Now, every time an African was sold, they had to take the mark of their owner. And to do that, they would brand you. They would put you on your knees and brand you on your arm, your back, or on your chest. And these are the kind of branding irons that they would use.
So she's gonna help you.
You see these branding irons? These are the branding irons that they used to brand the slaves with. They would put these in hot coals and they would become red hot. Now, they branded animals in the same way, but you know, an animal has thick skin, thick hide, thick fur. So when they touch an animal, they barely feel it. They thought of us as animals as well. And they would hit us so hard that sometimes it would hit a collarbone or hit tissue. Many of the Africans died from the infections that they got from these brandings. Sometimes an African might have 2 or 3 brandings on them, even before they leave the shores of Africa, because they were always sold to the highest bidder. Now, you know what I find fascinating today? You have some African Americans who voluntarily have themselves branded. Forever, the door of no return. Every one of those castles has a door of no return. You may have seen Barack and Michelle Obama standing on the one in South Africa. Again, look at this sculpture. This sculpture is very rare. It's thousands of years old. It's from Benin. Most of your African sculptures don't show their people in shackles. But if you notice, he has shackles on his ankles, behind his back, and he has a mouthpiece in his mouth. Why would you suppose he would have a mouthpiece there? You know why? As I said, they were trying to get you down to the shoreline as quickly as possible. And they didn't want you screaming and making noise, because then that would alert other slavers. Again, slavery was terribly, terribly chaotic. Let's move over here. Now we're going to talk about conditions on the slave ship. I'm sure all of you have seen this diagram before. That shows you how the men, the males, were held on the slave ships initially. They would lay you on your back or on your side, on shelves. Now, it took 2 to 3 months to get from the shores of Africa into North America. You can't lay on your back for that long period of time because your lungs collapse and you die. Once they started realizing that they were losing too much of their human cargo, they started sitting the males up, closely cropped between each other's legs, very tightly cropped. And understand that nobody had clothes on. Everybody was naked on a slave ship. You weren't walking around in jeans and t-shirts, all right? Now, they were so tightly packed and they would shackle you down with something like this. This is an actual middle passage shackle. Now I want you to notice, this shackle has a lock on it. You can't get out of that yourself. That has to be cut out, all right? Now, I'm going to show you one that doesn't have a lock on it to demonstrate how the shackle would be utilized. Now, if they didn't have enough to go around just for one shackle, for one enslaved African, one of these rungs will come off and go around the ankle of one male slave. The other rung will come off and go around the ankle of another male slave. And again, you'd be locked in. Now, I want you to notice how mobile these shackles are. They're constantly rubbing up and down the front of the leg. I'm sure you can imagine what's happening. It's breaking the skin open. Do you know that some of the Africans would reach down because maggots started living under this shackle? Maggots eat dead skin, dead wounds. In their hunger, they would reach down, grab a handful of maggots and eat them. They were trying to survive. Maggots won't hurt you. They're full of protein. They also started drinking their own urine because they realized that the salty seawater that they were being given was making them sick. Now, again, the men were held separately in the bottom of the ship or the bow, all right, or the hold rather, all right? You see them loading an African male into the hole there. And again, you were so tightly packed, even tighter than this picture, that enslaved African males were so tight, packed so tightly in the hulls of the ships that they could barely move while shackled to each other. Space for 5 men was not more than that of 2 modern single beds. And they're getting sick. They're throwing up. They're defecating. And if somebody is this close to your face, where do you think you're going to throw up? On them. And the same thing is happening to you. They said that you could smell a slave ship for 5 miles away because of the stench. And if you're attached to somebody for 2 or 3 months, somebody's bound to die. So you had decomposing bodies that they had to take out. And when they took that decomposed body that was attached to you, the body would fall apart. They would take a leg or an arm and throw it overboard. Something started following these slave routes because they knew that they were going to be fed just a few feet below the water. Yes, that's right, sharks. Sharks started following these slave routes during slavery. They developed a propensity for eating human flesh, black bodies that were thrown overboard during the Middle Passage. Again, it was awful. Here are the kind of wrist shackles that they used. These are wrist shackles that were used on the slave ships and anywhere else they needed to use them. Now, this shows you the transatlantic slave trade or the Middle Passage. Of course, this is Africa over here. This is South America down here. And then this area is the Caribbean, where they have many Caribbean islands where they took many of the enslaved Africans to. Haiti, Puerto Rico, the Bahamas, Jamaica. There they had plenty of sugar plantations, and they would take Africans who were hard to break into these Caribbean islands, and they were worked to death. To give you an idea how we were taken into Africa, look at this image. That's an image of little slave girls, little Afro-Latina slave girls in Puerto Rico in 1836. Look how dark they are. It's a result of slavery. Here is an actual census, an 1867 census, showing 2 Negro slaves on the census there in Puerto Rico. It was awful. So they had plenty of African slavery in Latin America. Now, as I mentioned to you, the men were held in the bottom of the ship. The women and children were held in the front of the ship. Now, the King of England at the time, George I, he had difficulty finding European men to volunteer to go and work on a slave ship. Many weren't willing to do that. So you know what he did? He went into the prison system and he offered the prisoners their freedom. He told them, you will receive a bounty at the end of the trip. But while you were on board the ship, you could have access to any of the females. Many of the females would be pregnant before they got to their final destination. Again, it was just hard for these people. Now, we're often asked, well, how many Africans were taken out of Africa? It's hard to determine. Many didn't make it down from that trek down to the coastline, which could take about a week. Many didn't make it out of those slave castles because the temperatures rose over 100 degrees. We're talking sub-Saharan temperatures. Many of them suffocated and died. And many didn't make it through those voyages. But this is a quote that my husband always says. If the sea would give up the dead in it, you could build a bridge that would stretch from the shores of West Africa to the shores of South Carolina, made of millions of bleached bones of enslaved Africans who were thrown overboard during the Middle Passage. Think about that. Mother Africa was literally raped and robbed of her most precious resource, her people. Now, this is something that you might find interesting. This is an image of a painting that hangs in a museum in Liverpool, England. It's titled, Taste the Sweat, an Englishman tastes the sweat of an African. Now, you may wonder why, but think about it. I'm sure at some point in time, you've probably tasted your sweat and it tastes salty, right? Well, that's because Africans and African Americans and people of color tend to hold a lot of salt in our bodies. God made us that way because of the sub-Saharan region that we came from. So they could literally taste the level of salt in an African to determine whether or not they could survive the Middle Passage. How about that? All right. But you know what? There's something to think about this system, because today, with this COVID, many of our people suffer from high blood pressure, diabetes, and other things as a result of our diets. We're taking in too much salt, and it is literally killing us. So if you're particularly salty, you might survive the Middle Passage. However, you might want to think about giving up all that soul food that you're eating. Just something to consider. Now, newly arrived captive Africans were scrubbed down with a mixture of gunpowder, lemon juice, seawater, and palm oil. Now, palm oil is indigenous to Africa. As a matter of fact, they have the Chinese in Africa right now fighting over palm oil. They use it to make their plastic products that they export to America and other parts of the world. So they would scrub these people down with these hard bristle brushes, trying to remove any scabs or sores. Then they would put that black palm oil on you to make you look healthy, but they were not in many cases. Now, this palm oil is something else that's going to come up later on in the presentation. And if you're wondering, well, look at these shackles. Some are very small and some are very large. Trust me, they had all sizes of shackles. Look at how emaciated these African slaves are aboard a slave ship. They may have started out heavy or fatter, but by the time they got to their final destination, they were emaciated. Now, some of the Africans started running away. And you've probably never thought about this before. But if you were a slave, would you run away? That's a rhetorical question for you to think about. Well, many did, and many got caught. And when they did catch you, they would bring you back and they would put this around your ankle. This is a runaway slave shackle. They would put this around your ankle, and every time you moved, the slave master could hear you. This one has little iron balls inside of it. This one has ringlets on it, which makes an even louder sound. And they wouldn't chase after you right away, because they had specially trained dogs that were trained to do nothing but hunt down runaway slaves. Now, these dogs were very vicious. These dogs were partially bred with the Mastiff, which is the largest of the dog breed, and a bloodhound. A bloodhound is known for its strong smell. Sometimes when there was a slave insurrection, they would let those dogs loose, and those dogs would tear those people apart. One slave was recorded as saying that he'd rather be shot by the master's musket than to be mauled by these dogs. Now, this is an article of a white man who heard his 3 children screaming in the distance, and he heard the dogs barking, and he realized, oh my God, those dogs are after my children. And he got on his horse and rode to where the sound was coming from. But by the time he got there, those dogs had already mauled his children to death. So he shot and killed the dogs. The owner of the dogs heard the commotion, and he came riding up on his horse and said, stop shooting my dogs. And the man shot him right through the heart. But when he went to court, the judge said, we're no longer going to use these dogs to hunt down niggers. As a matter of fact, they called them catch dogs formally, but the informal name were nigger dogs. So he would say, we're not going to use these dogs to hunt down niggers anymore because now they're attacking us. And we're going to start using them as fighting dogs and take wagers on them. So they started crossbreeding them with terrier, which gave them speed. They were smaller. And the English bull baiting dog, which they used in England to hold the bulls down in the pit. Because of their strong jaws, they could grab a bull by the softness of their neck, and they could hold that 80-ton bull down for however long they needed to. So imagine, if they could hold down an 80-ton bull, imagine what they could do to a human being. These dogs still exist today. They're called pit bulls. In many African-American communities, you have a lot of these young boys, they walk around with these pit bulls on long chains and these things around their neck, spiky collars around their neck. They had no idea that those dogs were used to hunt down their own people. Again, the only thing I could say to that is when you know better, you do better. Let's keep going. Now, you're in America, and things aren't going to get much better for these Africans. In fact, it's going to get considerably worse because now they're going to be auctioned off for the remainder of their lives. Auctions were a major event. They would have a slave go around early in the morning, ring the bell, come to the auction, come to the auction. And people would come from miles away to attend these auctions where human beings, Black African human beings, were being sold. And they would have signs listing where these slaves are going to be sold. This auction was held at a high school in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, sponsored by the Student Council and faculty. How bizarre is that? Sometimes they listed the names of the slaves that were going to be sold. Betsy. Betsy's a very likely girl, large, intelligent, handy, and healthy. She is acquainted with all kinds of housework and is a good breeder. And we're going to be talking about breeding in a little bit. But I first want to bring your attention to this image. This is a slave woman who is pleading for her child to be given back to her. Her child was literally snatched out of her arm and auctioned away. This happened over and over again. This is an actual child's leg shackle. Can you imagine putting a child this small in a shackle to keep it from crawling or toddling away? How despicable. Now, the first and foremost auction was held right in New York City on a place called Wall Street. Now, if you've ever been to New York, Wall Street is located near the ports. And it's called Wall Street today because the financiers and the investors who worked there, it was the financial district then, and it's still a financial district now. They had slaves build a wall that separated the financial district from the ports. That's how it got its iconic name, Wall Street. Now, when the ships would come in, they would send other complicit Africans onto the boats and tell them, set the healthiest looking slaves over in the corner for me. That practice is called to corner the market, and it's still used on Wall Street today, but they don't tell you why. Now, these bankers and financiers would loan money to other Europeans to purchase slaves. But if they defaulted on your loan, then those slaves would become the property of those banks. And you had banks like Wachovia Bank, Wells Fargo, Chase Manhattan Bank, Bank of America, even Lehman Brothers, who just went bankrupt in 2008 with the housing debacle. Do you know many of those people are still living off generational wealth that they earned during slavery? They made so much money that they were able to start other economies around the world. It was also the start of white supremacy that we're still dealing with today. Sometimes entire families were sold on the auction block. The mother, the father, as well as the children. You may wonder, which family member was sold first? Well, I'll tell you, they always sold the father first. Europeans realized in an early time that if you sell the father first, you weaken the family. So he was always sold first. Now I'm going to give you some more information as to why that's so important. Slave marriages were illegal, but many of the slaves really wanted to commit to each other. And they would have secret ceremonies where they would jump the broom, a tradition that they brought from their African culture. And they would say vows that included in sickness and in health or separation. We've dropped the separation part because we're no longer being auctioned off. But understand, all of this was done by design. Remember, again, these people wanted to be together. They wanted to keep their families together, but they had no choice when they were auctioned off. So much so that a slave child was more likely to live with both parents in a household than a Black child born today, because slaves were determined to keep their families together. I'm going to repeat that because it's very significant. A slave child was more likely to live in a household with both parents than a Black child born today. Now, if they could keep their families together during slavery, when they had people selling them away as much as they tried to, it goes to show that we can do the same. Now, this is an actual slave shackle that was used on the auction block. It reads, A. Goldman and Son, Slave Auction, Atlanta, Georgia, 1853. This is another one of our rare shackles. Now, they often made males fight each other for the master's amusement. They would have them drink liquor, get drunk, and have them butt each other in the head and take wagers on who would be the first to be knocked out. Now, there was one slave whose name was Big Luther. In addition to being a great fighter, he was also a prolific breeder. And his master would take him from plantation to plantation to fight other slaves. And Big Luther never lost a fight, but he was vicious. He would do anything to win. He would bite out his opponent's jugular vein or gouge out his opponent's eyes. And when he won, they would bring him back to the plantation, strip him naked, and rub him down with that black palm oil that I mentioned. And he would strut, they would put him in an open air hay-filled pen. And whites would stand around and cheer him on as he strutted, showing off his huge muscles and his huge genitalia. And they would put this around his neck. Now, this is a leather slave collar. Big Luther was a Mandingo. Give you an idea how big he is, look at the circumference of that belt. This could fit around some women's waist, all right? And this is what the belt says. Big Luther, breeder, Lawson and Matthias, purveyors of Black African Negroes, Front Royal, Virginia, 1853. So they would put this around his neck, like a form of advertising. These purveyors or sellers of these slaves would put this around his neck. And again, he'd strut around as whites would cheer him on. And they would take young virgin girls, some as young as 15 years old, throw them in a pen at him and watch as he molested these girls one right after the other. It's said that Big Luther sired over 150 children in his lifetime. It's a lot of children, isn't it? But you know what? We still have Big Luthers in our community that go through our community spreading their seeds and leaving the mothers and the children to fend for themselves. And by the way, the people who sold Big Luther and other slaves were the Masons. Now, I'm not talking about Prince Hall Masons. They came many years later. They're the Black Masons. They weren't allowed to join the European Masons. The European Masons were made up of our founding fathers, like these men. These 12 presidents of the United States were all slave owners. 41 signers of the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. Now, these men were considered the architects of the nation, all right? And they had a symbol, and this symbol is a square and a compass. To give you proof that these Masons sold slaves, there is actually a Mason symbol on this collar. Can you see it there? Hopefully you can. So you could go to the Masons to buy yourself a horse or purchase yourself a nigger. Imagine that. Now, in 1807, Britain banished slavery on the open seas, meaning she no longer allowed the ships to go in to bring more Africans out. But these colonizers, they still wanted free labor. So they had to figure out a way to create more slaves. So ranchers who were raising pigs and horses and cows realized that they could make more money breeding slaves. And they started breeding farms. They would take a big black buck, which is what they called a male slave, and pair him with a big or healthy fertile wench, which is what they called a female slave. And they were ordered to produce a prime slave baby. If a pregnancy didn't, if a prime baby, if a pregnancy wasn't produced in a certain amount of time, that man would be given to another man, that man would be given to another woman, and that woman would be given to another man. And this would go on and on and on. It caused such destruction in our families to the point where today we have more baby mamas and baby daddies in our community than we have husbands and wives. It's a vestige of slavery. We have to know our history in order to make our lives better. We have to stop living in these purposely designed atmospheres that are keeping us suppressed today. Now, this is an actual slave girl who I wrote about in one of my films, which I can tell you about later. She had just arrived in America. She can't even believe that she survived the Middle Passage. Now, even though they're showing her in clothes, all the Africans were always on the auction block naked because they wanted to check every orifice of your body, your ears, your nose, your mouth, even your private parts. But the last few weeks of the voyage, her stomach was swollen and her breast was swollen, and she had a horrible headache. And all of these white men were holding up wads of money and they were shouting, "Twofer, twofer." She didn't understand the language. She didn't know what they meant. It wasn't until after she was sold and on a plantation where she had the first of 15 children where they were saying twofer, twofer, two for the price of one. Because if you bought her, you would buy that child. Slave badges, slave tags, they were given to males who were leased out to other plantations. And they had to have a tag or a piece of paper from their master saying that they had permission to be off the plantation. Now they had white men that would patrol the roads at night looking for a runaway slave, all right? And they would stop you and say, "Show me your tag or paper, nigger." And if you didn't have one, you could be beaten, sold back into slavery, or worse, killed. Well, guess what? This was the start of American policing. Slave patrols were the militias of the Second Amendment. And these white men, by the way, were mostly Irishmen. Now, Irishmen were used as indentured servants. They worked right along the Africans. And the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who were the elite whites, didn't think much of the Irishmen no more than they did the Africans, all right? So these Irishmen self-designated themselves to become slave patrollers, and the slaves called them patty rollers because of the Irish potato patties that they had in their native land. Decades later, when vehicles were invented, they called the wagons that they drove paddy wagons. Now you know where it came from. But fast forward to today, because we're watching history repeat itself. We have laws on the book called Stop and Frisk. And these police officers stop anybody who they who they think look guilty or they suspect them of something. And we've seen these stops. They have become deadly in many cases. And of course, who do they stop mostly? Black and brown men, men of color. So understand, though much has changed, much has remained the same. And you know what is interesting? Many of your white police officers today have Scot-Irish surnames. They have maintained their roles in policing. Sometimes the master would choose his most dutiful slave. They would call them black slave drivers. And he was far more brutal than the white people, than the white men. We have black faces in high places today. Some of them are police officers. Some of them are judges or lawyers. Some have made it even as far away as the Supreme Court, but I'm not mentioning any names. This is the slave catcher Shackle. What the slave catchers use to take you to auction, all right? Now, I have a white friend who works here in the museum with me. He's actually a correction officer, and he brings young boys here to hopefully scare them straight so that they won't get into any more trouble. He said, I'm going to share something with you, but if you say that I said it, I'll deny it. He said, when we take all prisoners to court, we always put them in wrist shackles. But when we take black men to court, not only do we put them in wrist shackles, we also put them in leg shackles because the white judges like to get shackles rubbing on the courtroom floor. Now that's straight up racism, isn't it? Of course it is. But you know what? I have every reason to believe him, especially after I saw this in the newspaper in 2019. This is a black man being pulled through the streets by two white mounted police officers as if he were a slave. This was taken in 2019, but it could easily have been taken in 1819. Know your history, lest we forget. These are the kind of leather whips that they would use to beat the slaves with. And they would leave these horrible marks in your body. They would soak the ends of these whips in brine or salt water, and they would become as sharp as a razor's edge. And when it slashed through your body, it created a cracking sound. Many of the slaves started calling the white man that was quick to use a whip a cracker. He also called them rednecks because their face and their necks turned red. Now, you may be familiar with this picture. This man's name is Gordon, or Gordon Peter. He had two first names. Gordon said he had been beaten from the time he was a boy until he escaped from the Confederate Army. Just like my husband's uncle, his master had taken him to the army to fight for the Confederates. But it wasn't long before these colored soldiers realized that it was the Confederates that were trying to keep them in slavery, and it was the Union that were trying to free him. When they saw his picture, many of the Northerners sympathized with these colored soldiers. But Gordon, despite his harsh beginnings, went on to become a celebrated Union soldier and died a free man. They beat women too. Women weren't spared from whippings. They would tie you to a post and beat you. If a woman was pregnant, they would dig a hole, have her lay her belly in the hole, and beat her across the back because he didn't want to destroy that property that she was carrying. Let's take a moment to talk about house slaves versus field slaves, light skin versus dark skin. Some of us are under the preconceived notion that light skins had it good. I could tell you they did not. They had light skin because they were conceived through rape of an enslaved Black mother by a white slave-owning father. They simply came out light-skinned, but they were still slaves. And they were forced to live in the house with their very oppressors, who were often their own family members. The slave mistress couldn't even stand many of these children because Many of the children looked more like her husband than her own children, and she was very mean to them. One slave woman was interviewed that said, one white lady that lived near us slipped in the colored gal's room and cut her baby's head clean off because she knew it belonged to her husband. Oftentimes, the light-skinned slaves were also the first to be sold because it just caused too much commotion in most homes. Now, field slaves usually had dark skin, either because their African lineage was never broken, which is something they should be proud of, or the fact that they had to work in the hot sun for many hours. Now, they only got clothing once a year, which left them ragged most of the time. Now, many of these young boys that worked in the field were runaways because they had freedom of movement and they wouldn't be noticed missing for so long. So most of your runaways started out as young boys. Now, I don't know whether you heard about this or not, but Georgetown University just recently apologized for selling slaves to save the land that Georgetown University is built on. This is a shackle from Georgetown slave plantation. It reads, property of Georgetown Plantation Police for a Negro woman or child only. Now, they apologized and they also came up with a reparation program that said, if you could prove that your family member was sold on Georgetown University, you could go there tuition free. Over 100 Black families have taken advantage of that. But I understand they've already started making changes because promises made are not always promises kept. This is an image of a slave girl with a collar around her neck, similar to this brass female collar that would be given to a well-to-do white woman, perhaps for her anniversary or for her birthday. But it wasn't for her to wear. She would put this around her slave girl's neck and she would attach a leash to it. And when she went to town, she would pull her slave girl behind her as if she were a pet. Imagine how humiliating that had to be for the slave girl. Now, there is a famous jeweler that uses as a prototype to create his famous collar that many women buy for today, or choker collar. And notice it has a little heart-shaped locket on it. Now, I'm not going to mention the name, but they come in little blue boxes. That's all I'll say about that. Let's talk about the Underground Railroad, which wasn't a train, of course. It was comprised of white abolitionists or white people who worked with freed and enslaved Black people who wanted to abolish slavery. Like this man, Levi Coffin. He was a Quaker and an abolitionist. He lived near the Ohio River, and he would hide slaves in his house during the day, and at night, he would have them taken down to boats and rowed across the Ohio River into Canada, where they were free. And then there's this man, William Still, considered the father of the Underground Railroad. He worked right here in Philadelphia. If you saw the movie Harriet, he was the man that fell off the chair when Harriet kept bringing all those slaves through his office. He couldn't believe she was bringing all those people through his office. He kept copious notes of the slaves that came through his office, and he paired them up with white people, hoping that they would be able to find their family members later in life. This man, Henry Box Brown, wrote a letter to William Still, letting him know that he was going to mail himself in a box from Virginia to Philadelphia. That's how he was going to escape from slavery. And he wrote that letter to William Still. He put holes in the box so he could relieve himself. He ate raw potatoes and nuts and fried fruit. 2 months later, he arrived in Philadelphia, and they told Mr. Still that he had a box waiting for him at the dock. And when Mr. Still went to open the box, out popped Henry Box Brown. True story. Then there's this man, Frederick Douglass, born into slavery. His slave mistress taught him how to read the Bible when he was young, but he wanted so much to learn that sometimes he would steal bread from the kitchen and he would run down to the road and offer the poor white children a piece of bread. He said, I'll give you a piece of bread if you tell me everything that you learned in school today. And he went on to become a famous lecturer. And then there was my hero, whose last name I don't even have to mention. Harriet Tubman was illiterate most of her life, but she did learn how to sign her name as an adult. She had a decent penmanship, didn't she? And you know what she said? She could have saved more slaves if they knew they were slaves. What she meant by that, if all you knew was slavery, you were afraid to go into freedom. Even her own brother, who she had taken into freedom, threatened to go back to the plantation. She put a gun in his mouth and said, I'd rather blow your brains out than let you go back into slavery. Now I'm going to move over here and share something with you that you might find shocking. This, as you can see, is a Ku Klux Klan robe. That robe was given to us by a white man who said that he was ashamed of his father's actions. He kept it hidden in an attic so his children and his grandchildren wouldn't find it. But he says, now I'm getting old. Please put this in your museum and let your people know that not all white people are racist. And we know that not all white people are racist. Those abolitionists couldn't have been racist. They tried to save the slaves, all right? This young boy was killed by the Klan when I was a young girl. His name was Emmett Till. Now, just like my husband, his mother sent her only child from Chicago to Mississippi to spend time with her favorite uncle. A white woman accused him of whistling at her or winking at her. Her story kept changing. The Klan came in the middle of the night, snatched this boy out. When they found his body, his mother was so horrified that she insisted that they keep an open casket so the world could see what they did to her beautiful son. That white woman who said that he whistled or winked at her just a few years ago acknowledged that she lied. Her name is Carolyn Bryant. She's still living, she's in her 90s, and she's writing a book about it. Unfortunately, the statute of limitations have run out, so she can't be punished. Now, the Klan, they were brazen. I mean, they looked right in your face. Sometimes they wore suits. Many of them were law enforcement officers. They had no idea, no fear of ever being caught or ever being punished. In the same way, this man stood on George Floyd's neck for almost 10 minutes. He had no idea the revolution that he would start with the Black Lives Matter movement, where you have white, Black, Asian, Puerto Rican, all marching together to stop the injustice that was going on. And I suspect that they'll be back this summer as well. Now I want you to look at this painting. And as you look at this painting, notice where the shackles are. They're not on his ankles. They're not on his wrists. They're on his head. What that signifies is mental slavery. If you look here in the corner, there's a book with a key over it. All he has to do is open that box and use the key to open the door where all those Black leaders are there to teach in his history. He's suffering from mental slavery. Many other Blacks suffer from mental slavery today. And as a result of suffering from mental slavery, this is what we're doing to ourselves today. Slavery taught us self-hatred that became so self-hating that now we kill ourselves. Now, in the beginning, I told you that the Europeans gave Africans guns, right? Well, guns are still contributing to the violence in our communities today. Lax gun laws. So again, though much has changed, much has remained the same. And these are all obituaries. Obituaries of young Black men who were killed. They weren't killed by white cops. They weren't killed by the Klan. So who do you think killed them? You're right, killed by brothers. We have got to stop the violence in our community. We have to understand the sanctity of life. There are more Blacks in prison or on probation today than were slaves before the Civil War. If Black lives matter, we must stop the violence towards each other. Again, though much has changed, much has remained the same. Over here, I want to talk to you about the Jim Crow period, where ridiculous laws and horrendous acts occurred during this period to just, again, make us look foolish and to treat us so horribly bad. I don't know if you heard about this, but they used Black babies as alligator bait during the Jim Crow era. My husband uncovered the fact that they used these babies as alligator bait because he was finding things with a baby featured on an alligator or in an alligator's mouth. And he found a man who said, yes, his grandfather used to take him on alligator hunts. He said they would snatch these babies right out of their mother's arms, take these babies down to the swamp at night, tie a rope around the baby's torso, and throw the baby in the swamp. Naturally, when the alligator came up and latched onto the alligator, they would hit the alligator in the head with a pickaxe so they wouldn't destroy his skin, because he used his skin, he sold his skin to make alligator shoes and alligator pocketbooks and things. Years later, a candy manufacturer came out with a candy that they called Little African, featuring a bug-eyed black baby and a hungry-looking alligator. And look what the caption reads, a dainty morsel. Now, if you did not know that our babies were used as alligator bait, that would go right over your head, wouldn't it? This is an actual postcard that I blew up that they would sell. It reads, I'm just as scared as I can be. I'm afraid this gator's going to get me. Oh, mammy, come and get me soon, or you won't have no little coon. How could they make fun of something so horrible? And they even sold these in their gift shops. This is an alligator pencil sharpener, and the pencil represents the baby. Not even our babies escape the horrors of slavery. This is called Southern hospitality. This is a Black woman nursing her child on one breast and a white child on the other breast, but she couldn't switch breasts, otherwise she'd be beaten. Ridiculous, just like separate water fountains with the same plumbing. Or here, it was typical for all men to tip their hats in the presence of a white woman, but Black men had to hold their hat over their private parts just in case he had a sudden erection looking at a beautiful white woman. Because most of these men were lynched because they accused them of killing or raping a white woman. It never happened. They call that French strange fruit. Then they had these signs during the Jim Crow period, which separated us from the whites. And look at this one, no dogs, Negroes, or Mexicans. Even the dog got first preference. Colored seated in the rear. And remember me telling you about the Irish? This is a classified ad that I blew up showing that no Irish need apply for a job. Separate water fountains. They also created a word that is used much too much in our community today. Sometimes the N-word was the last word a Black man heard before he was lynched or stomped to death. Yet we use it as a term of endearment. And the way I can prove this is that they use that word on items that they sold. This is a label from a can of shrimp called niggerhead shrimp. Or this one, a can of smoking tobacco called nigger hair smoking tobacco. Or here, a can of Black boot polish called nigger boot polish. The word nigger wasn't created by us. That word was created by oppressors of Black people. And every time we use that word, we disgrace our ancestors. Young people, I'm asking you, I know you have it in your rap songs and you love the word, but it's not a kind word. Think about the people who died before you. That's the last words they may have heard before they were killed. Please, I hope in your generation that you'll stop using it. During the Jim Crow period, they created household items like this. This is a Mammy cookie jar, all right? And they also had household items like you see here, salt and pepper shakers, all right? That they kept on their tables. But if you look closely, you'll notice they don't have any professionals. They're all cooks, butlers, and the such, all right? Again, to make us look foolish. And they use watermelon a lot in their ads. Watermelon was very easy to raise in the South. So they would have the enslaved people who worked in the melon patch make the watermelon look good so white people would buy it. Here is an actual 1980s General Electric ad with a Black boy eating fried chicken. Now you tell me, what does eating fried chicken have to do with selling an electric appliance? Again, just to make us look foolish. Here, you have a sign called The Midnight Shopper. It's an advertisement. Look at how poor the boy looks. But the title, The Midnight Shopper, you know what that infers? That blacks steal. That's the inference that they give you. This is a game that was given to white kids to play. But look at the title, Darkies in the Melon Patch. So they would throw the dice and they would jump from space to space. Those white kids were being taught to be racist just by playing a game. Everything was done to make us look foolish. This is an actual 1912 calendar featuring a black man showing off his pearly white teeth called Darky Toothpaste. This is an actual tube of toothpaste that my son found in China in 2018. He bought it. It's still in the market there today. This statuette is of a South African slave woman whose name was Sarah Bartman. Sarah Bartman, they killed her father and her husband and sold her into slavery to an animal trainer who was fascinated by her body shape. She was only 4 feet tall, but she was very developed for her size. She had big breasts and a huge derriere. And he put her in freak shows. And white people, and he gave her name, her stage name was Lady Hottentot. And they would put her in nude colored clothing that made you think that she was nude. And whites would pay money to come and look at her body. These little things that they're saying here are written in French. One of them says, look at her areolas. Imagine how humiliating that had to be. They gave her alcohol and she ended up turning into an alcoholic, and they also prostituted her out. She died at only 25 years old. Even after her death, they made a plaster image of her body, kept it next to her skeleton remains. They cut out her vagina and her breasts and put it in alcohol jars, saying that they were going to prove that Black women were more sexually promiscuous than white women. Again, this was horrible. But when Nelson Mandela became president in 2002, he demanded that her body parts be returned to South Africa, where he gave her a decent burial. Now, what is interesting about this, I have this information in our little known Black history booklet, which your teachers can buy later on. You have that and many other documents in this booklet, which I can tell Mr. Rashan later about. But I always like to leave my presentations on a high note. Understand that African Americans have contributed greatly to American society. Just like Michelle Obama said, the White House was built by slaves. The Capitol was also built by slaves, even those insurrectionists who were on January 6th claimed it wasn't. The truth about the Statue of Liberty is that it was given to us by France to commemorate the abolishment of slavery. She has chains around her ankles. You can't see it when you take the boats around the Hudson River. You have to be in a helicopter, but they're there. And look at all the inventions. Look at all the inventions. The lawnmower, the gas light, the gas mask, I'm sorry. The light bulb that was invented by Lewis Latimer, not Thomas Edison. The mailbox, the toilet, washing machine, everyday items, ironing board, folding bed. We can go on and on. But let me tell you some more contemporary inventions that were done in not so long ago. The next time you go on the internet and you type in a URL that ends with .com, you can thank that man there, Mr. Emmett McHenry. He came up with the scientific code for .com. Further up, this man here, Mr. Herbert Smitherman, he worked for Procter & Gamble, and he created the components that go in Crest toothpaste, Folger coffee, Bounce fabric softener, and Safeguard soap. This woman here, Katherine Johnson, she worked for NASA. Many of the astronauts wouldn't even go into outer space until she checked their figures. They even made a movie about her called Hidden Figures. This man, Dion Bluford, the first Black man in outer space. And that woman next to her is Mae Jemison, the first Black woman in outer space. This man, Dr. Mark Dean, who worked for IBM, he invented the laptop computer, the personal computer that many of us have in our homes today. And you may not have heard about this, but Jack Daniels, the bourbon giant, just acknowledged that it was a slave that taught Jack Daniels the recipe for Jack Daniel's whiskey. They said the locals knew about it, but now they're telling us. And you know what else? A group of Black business people got together and they came up with a smooth whiskey. I say that because that's what they told me. I'm not a drinker. And they said they're going to give the proceeds to the slaves' family members. His name was Uncle Nearest. And this woman, I really could not live without her invention. That grandmotherly looking woman, her name is Dr. Gladys West, and she is the inventor of GPS technology. Who knew? Next to her is Dr. Shirley Jackson, first Black woman to earn a PhD in physics from MIT. Many of the Bluetooth technology that we use today comes from many of her inventions. And you know what else, boys, you young men? I know like many of you like to play video games. Well, this man, Jerry Lawson, he invented the first tabletop video games that are still used in many of the video games today. Now, remember me telling you about the entrepreneurship in the Ragsdale clan? You may have heard about Black Wall Street. Black Wall Street was an independent city. They had their own doctors, their own lawyers, their own bankers, their own schools. Well, guess what? The Ragsdales had the funeral business, the mortuary business. This was featured in a documentary on PBS that shows one of my husband's family members standing outside there. That building, though, the business was burnt down during the Wall Street debacle, but it has been reestablished, and we have two of them, one in San Diego, California, and the other one in Ardmore, Oklahoma. What I have shared with you is not Black history. It's American history. We must remember that. You can't talk about American history and ignore the hundreds of years of slavery and bondage of our people. Yet, despite all that, we are still here. We're still contributing. Blacks have no reason to be ashamed of slavery. You know who should be ashamed of slavery? America. We must remember the legacy of slavery, lest we forget. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I have time for a few questions if anybody has any.
Question, at one of the moments when it was muted about the branding, if you could just repeat what you had said in regards to the branding of African Americans.
When an enslaved African was sold, they had to take the mark of their owner and they would brand them on their back, their chest, or on their arm. I find it fascinating that many African Americans today voluntarily have themselves branded. It's because they don't know their history. And when you know better, you do better. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you for that.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
I have a question as well.
Oh, I'm sorry.
How many years did it take you and your family to collect everything? And how did you go about collecting all these different things? What was your process?
As I said in the beginning, my husband started collecting these things over 60 years ago because he was inspired by that first shackle that I showed you. Many he bought, some he found. He actually started collecting it in the 60s, and he hooked up with a group of white Confederate Civil War buffs. And when I said he hooked up with them, he started traveling with them, and they were looking for items that were left over during the Civil War. They would dig bullets out of trees or find old canteens. And they actually took my husband under his wing. My husband is a fair-skinned man, and when he was young, he had reddish hair and he has green eyes. So I think that they thought that he was a safe Black man. They took them under his wing. One of them even gave him his first metal detector and showed him how to use it. Because my husband was such a voracious reader, he found out that the Confederates, when they didn't want things found, they would throw them in outhouses. So he started looking for real grassy knolls. Some things he found right in the ground there. One time he told me that he was in a barn with one of the white guys, and the white guy said, "Hey, Joe, you seem to be real fascinated by all these chains and things. Here's a horse bridle," and threw it at him. But when my husband looked at it, he realized it wasn't a horse bridle, but a slave shackle. Two of those white gentlemen left their collection of slavery artifacts to my husband when they died. So we have been told by the Smithsonian in Washington, the African American Museum there, that we may have the most extensive collection of slavery hardware in the United States, because that was his concentration. Unfortunately, we're in a smaller location than we were originally, so much of our collection is in storage. But just seeing what we have here really is proof positive of how different we came to America. Yes, we came on boats, but they were not called the Mayflower, and we did not have our own private cabin. So this is proof positive of how different coming to America was for enslaved Africans. Any more questions?
Thank you.
I have a question. How did the babies be the crocodile bait when they went underwater?
Well, they were thrown in the water. They would tie a rope around their torso and throw the babies in the water. Naturally, the baby's going to be agitated, and the alligators would just come up and clamp on them and kill them. It's a very sad episode in American history. Man's inhumanity to man.
I have a question as well. Can you guys hear me?
I hear you.
Okay. So back to the branding. I know a lot of fraternities do it, and that kind of like a big culture within like football and that in some of the sports. Is there a correlation between that, or is this kind of there's not being educated and knowledgeable on where it comes from?
Well, there definitely is a correlation, but why they have picked it up in Black fraternities is beyond me. I just know that they do it as well. I'll tell you a quick story. When my daughter, my grandson is videotaping me, but when his mother was a young girl, my brother we were at a family reunion, and my brother had his shirt off. And she said, "Uncle Jeffrey, what is that on your arm?" And he said, "Oh, I got kicked by a horse." She didn't think anything of it until she was in college. She was a freshman at Syracuse University. She called me in the middle of the night and said, "Mommy, do you remember when Uncle Jeffrey told me he got kicked by a horse?" I said, "No." She said, "Well, he didn't. That's his fraternity mark." So I just tell young people their history. Make up your mind, but know your history, because you don't want to keep repeating things that are vestiges of slavery. We're doing that much too much to our own detriment.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Again, I want to thank Longwood High School for inviting me. I hope to be able to visit you one day with our traveling exhibit, which we take all over the country and, quite frankly, the world. We've been as far away as Brazil with our collection. So perhaps when this pandemic is over, your school administrators will invite me to Longwood. We usually go to Uniondale every year, but of course we can't during the pandemic. So I'm going to ask you again, thank you for your time and attention, and stay safe. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
At this point, I just want to thank everyone that's
Thank
on this call. Very enlightening. My dad was actually from Sierra Leone, West Africa, and she basically enlightened me on some things that took place there.
Hi,
But
Mr.
we will
Denon.
continue to press on and have the Slave Museum come back to our district and speak to the youth next year. Thank everybody for participating. Have a good night.